Mark Carney just boarded a plane to New York City. Not to meet Donald Trump, not to visit the White House. He is flying straight to Wall Street to sit across from the most powerful CEOs, money managers, and capital allocators in America and tell them, forget the politics. Canada is open for business. That trip lands on May 27th and 28th, 2026. And the timing is not accidental. In 36 days, on July 1st, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement enters its mandatory joint review period. That is the mechanism that will determine whether this continental trade deal runs to the year 2042 or begins a slow, grinding collapse that no one in Ottawa, Washington, or Mexico City has a real plan for. Hundreds of billions of dollars in cross-border trade are riding on what happens next. And right now, with official talks between Canada and the United States effectively frozen, Carney has decided to go around Trump entirely and sell Canada directly to the people who actually move capital. Over the next few minutes, you will understand exactly what Carney is doing in New York, why the CUSMA review is more complicated and more dangerous than the headlines are letting on, and what the gap between Canada's strategy and political reality means for where this all ends up. Here is what we know. The Prime Minister's office confirmed that Carney will spend 2 days in New York, meeting with unspecified CEOs, entrepreneurs, business leaders, and capital managers. He will also deliver a formal address at the Economic Club of New York on Thursday, where he plans to lay out Canada's new economic strategy and how it is progressing. The official framing from the PMO is direct. Canada has what the world wants: an energy superpower with vast deposits of critical minerals, the most educated workforce in the G7, the lowest net debt to GDP ratio among G7 nations, and a business tax structure that Carney's government claims is now the most competitive in the G7 for new business investment. Those numbers are not invented. Foreign direct investment into Canada reached its highest level in nearly 2 decades. According to TD Economics, inflows hit their strongest point since 2007, with Canada pulling in $97 billion in foreign investment and more than 20 new economic and defense partnerships across 4 continents in the past year alone. RBC published a report projecting that Canada could attract up to $1.8 trillion over the next decade if it advances pipelines, LNG terminals, nuclear, hydro, renewables, and critical minerals processing. That is the pitch Carney is walking into the Economic Club with. That is what he wants Wall Street to hear. But here is what makes this trip more significant than a standard investment roadshow. Carney is not going to Washington. He is not in the Oval Office. He is not meeting with Jameson Greer at the USTR. He is in Lower Manhattan, pitching American capital directly, because the political channel to the Trump administration is effectively closed. Let's go back to October 2025 to understand how we got here. The Ontario provincial government ran a television advertisement featuring former President Ronald Reagan, describing tariffs as causing job losses and trade wars. Trump saw it. He called it fraudulent, and on Truth Social, he announced that all trade negotiations with Canada were hereby terminated, in capital letters. That is not a routine diplomatic disagreement. That is a public declaration that the channel is shut over a provincial advertisement that Carney's federal government did not produce. White House advisor Kevin Hassett told reporters that the frustration with Canada had been building, calling Canada very difficult to negotiate with, and citing a lack of flexibility. Carney said Canada stands ready to resume talks whenever appropriate. Trump told reporters at a Kennedy Center event that he has a great relationship with Canada, said, "We'll work it out," and then answered, "We'll see," when asked if talks would actually resume. As of this week, they haven't. The formal trade negotiation between the two countries is in limbo, and the CUSMA review clock is running. Now, what actually happens on July 1st? Because there is an enormous amount of confusion about this, and it matters. CUSMA does not expire in 2026. The agreement runs until 2036. What July 1st triggers is the mandatory joint review written into Article 34.7 of the agreement, its so-called sunset clause. At that review, each party must confirm in writing whether it wants to extend CUSMA for another 16 years through to 2042. If all three parties agree, the agreement is extended, and the next scheduled review comes in 2032. If any party does not confirm, CUSMA stays in force, but annual joint reviews must take place until 2036. So it doesn't snap off like a light switch. But what the Eurasia Group's risk analysis described is arguably worse than a clean break. CUSMA staggering on as what they called a zombie, neither fully dead nor alive. Tariff exemptions for CUSMA-compliant goods, keeping free trade on life support, while everything else remains in dispute. That is the scenario nobody in a boardroom wants. Permanent uncertainty is harder to plan around than a clean break. And the context in which this review is happening is, by any measure, not ordinary. Legal experts who have examined the agreement closely point out that the review is not occurring against the backdrop of a normally functioning CUSMA, but one in deep distress. Parallel sectoral tariff negotiations on steel, aluminium, and autos are running simultaneously. The USTR's 2026 National Trade Estimate Report laid out a consistent list of US grievances with Canada: dairy supply management, softwood lumber subsidies, the Online Streaming Act, the Online News Act, data residency requirements, and what Washington describes as non-market practices. Every one of those is a pressure point that can be weaponized at the review table. Trump himself has publicly said he is open to letting CUSMA expire and pursuing new deals. He has also described Canada as making things we don't need because we make them also. That is not the language of a leader preparing to rubber stamp a 16-year extension. So what does Carney do with all of this? He does not wait. He builds a parallel track. Because if the political relationship with the White House is frozen, the next best move is to build so much American capital invested in Canada that the business community creates its own pressure on Washington to protect that exposure. That is not speculation. That is the logic of the New York trip. Carney has been running this playbook since day one in office. He has been to India, Australia, and Japan. He signed a new trade partnership with China in January 2026, the first Canadian prime ministerial visit to Beijing in nearly a decade. That deal includes a quota of 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles entering Canada annually at a 6.1% tariff rate, and China lowering its tariffs on Canadian canola seed from roughly 85% down to approximately 15%, with reductions on lobster, peas, and crabs as well. He signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with the European Union and joined SAFE, Europe's defense procurement arrangement. He has struck 12 other trade and security agreements across 4 continents in his first 6 months. Carney has publicly described Canada's historical over-reliance on the United States as a weakness. He has said it plainly in a policy address. He is committed to doubling Canada's non-US exports by 2035. He has created a major projects office to fast-track approvals for pipelines, LNG, nuclear, and critical minerals infrastructure, with a stated goal of catalyzing $1 trillion in total investment over 5 years. He has announced the first ever Canada Investment Summit, scheduled for September 14th and 15th in Toronto, designed to attract global capital into clean energy, critical minerals, and artificial intelligence. And in April, his government announced the Canada Strong Fund, a sovereign wealth fund, the first in Canadian history, which will invest in strategic domestic projects and allow ordinary Canadians to buy in directly. That is a serious economic restructuring program. The numbers are moving. But there is a structural problem sitting underneath all of it that no amount of roadshowing in New York fully resolves. Canada still sends close to 70% of its merchandise exports to the United States. That is not a policy choice that can be unwound in months or even years. Export Development Canada's own economists have calculated that to reduce merchandise exports to the US by just 10%, Canada would have to double its exports to China, Germany, France, Mexico, Italy, and India simultaneously. That is the scale of the dependency that decades of NAFTA and then CUSMA integration created. You do not undo it with a trade mission to Tokyo and a canola deal with Beijing, however significant those moves are individually. This is the contradiction at the center of Carney's strategy. He is in New York pitching Canada to American investors as a sovereign, independent economic power with its own trajectory, while knowing that if CUSMA comes apart or degrades into an annual review zombie, the industries most exposed are the ones built around deep continental integration: autos, steel, aluminium, softwood, agriculture. The Canadian workers in those sectors don't have a China pivot available to them, and the political relationship that governs all of this remains, at best, informal. Carney and Trump have had conversations on the sidelines of international events, including a half-hour meeting during the FIFA World Cup draw earlier this year. Trump described it as very productive and said they talked mostly trade. Whether that conversation translates into resumed formal negotiations before July 1st is unclear. The White House has not signaled any timeline. Canada has said it will re-engage when appropriate. That is not a negotiating schedule. That is a placeholder. What is happening in New York this week is Carney making a bet. The bet is that the language American CEOs speak to their government is louder than the language of tariff policy. That if enough major capital allocators come out of meetings with the Canadian Prime Minister and write checks into Canadian energy, infrastructure, and critical minerals, the business lobby in Washington will decide that protecting those investments matters more than the political friction at the top. It has worked before, in other contexts, for other governments. It is not guaranteed to work here, against a president who has demonstrated that he is willing to absorb significant business community displeasure in pursuit of his trade agenda. And the CUSMA clock does not care how the bet turns out. July 1st arrives whether or not Carney comes back from New York with a single signed investment commitment. The review begins on Canada Day. The three parties will have to put something in writing, and right now, the two parties his relationship most determines the outcome of that review are not officially talking. That is a situation that Carney is walking into when he steps up to that podium at the Economic Club of New York. He will say Canada has what the world wants. He will be right about the assets. The critical minerals are real. The fiscal position is real. The investment momentum is real. The educated workforce is real. What he cannot say, and what no one in his government has answered cleanly, is what happens to all of that on July 2nd if the review produces nothing but another year of managed uncertainty, steel tariffs, and a frozen negotiating channel. That question does not have a Wall Street answer. It has a Washington one. And right now, Washington isn't picking up the phone. If you found this breakdown useful, share it with someone following the Canada-US trade situation. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of how this develops before the July 1st deadline. And let me know in the comments whether you think Carney's Wall Street play actually changes anything in Washington, or whether this is optics while the real negotiation stays stuck.